All right, TV fans. Well, he brings all sorts of demons and historical locations to life. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby, and with me is John Heller, Visual Effects Supervisor for Penny Dreadful City of Angels, and also for The Outsider. Thank you for joining me, John. For Penny Dreadful, I just want to get right into kind of the biggest showpiece that opens the show, really, in that premiere, where Magda has all these flames around her. It's this massive opening visual effects showpiece, and I noticed that you have some experience on your resume with animating flames and everything. So what went into this specific sequence to make it unique?
Well, the whole show is kind of interesting in this way, where you're trying to do visual effects work that stays sort of in the real world, and the challenge with that sequence in particular is you see this, these workers in the field. It has a very old sort of world feeling, and it's very beautiful. The entire show is just shot beautifully, and you're kind of in this serene moment with a kid and his dad, and then there's this conversation between Magda and her sister, and then designing how she's going to bring her powers into this world, right? And not in a way that takes you out of the scene. It becomes like some giant visual effects, presence, but also how that becomes her force, right? And so throughout the show, there's this idea that she's able to do things, and other characters have this sort of otherworldly, sort of horror, driven powers. And how do you keep that grounded in the real world? So for the fire and the flames, it was kind of a multiple phase process where we had to decide, well, just, do we want to see it literally? Do you want it to be something that's unseen and everything just starts catching fire around her? And then it was decided that, no, this should be a pretty grandiose beginning and show sort of the full force of her and establish what she's done to this family and this group of people during this time. Of course, this is a flashback to what happened, to the little boy and his dad. So without becoming too fantastic, we did develop it so that the shape of the fire would flow around her deliberately, and it kind of became her cape in a way towards the end, and then framed the characters towards the end, where the father is burning and dies. The other challenge with that was we wanted to make sure that it felt physical, and so not just were the people being affected, but there was ash and heat distortion and smoke in the field, and the plants were burning, and so it definitely was in the world. It was charring everything, and no one could escape this thing, and it's controlled by her, but it's not hyper fantastic. It just had to remain very realistic.
Yeah, that's kind of a theme going on with the whole series, I think. And maybe I'm speaking as a layperson, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard from many people that like fire effects are very difficult to animate, and it's very impressive when it comes off as real. I remember Deepwater Horizon, when they got an Oscar nomination for visual effects. It was because so many people were blown away, they couldn't believe that was actually CG fire. So what is it about that type of effect that makes it so difficult to pull off?
Well, effects in general, in the world of CG, there's animation and look development and character and creature work and all kinds of different various entities that go into it. One of the most difficult and complex is real-world natural effects. And of course, this is smoke, fire, water, oceans, those type of effects. And you've seen in the last years, as our machines get faster and our ability to calculate mathematical functions get quicker, we're able to basically push more numbers, through the pipe to create better and better work. Whereas years ago, it was less a limitation of what we knew we wanted things to be and to look like. And I think the softwares were fairly adept. But the sheer amount of time it took to calculate real-world calculations in physical form, which is what we actually do, it's all mathematics. And these simulations took so much time that we were limited in the amount of detail and depth and scope, sort of the size and scale of things, because the bigger things are, the more calculations it takes. Now that machines are faster, more robust, it becomes easier on some level to achieve that because you get a quicker response, render times are less. However, just like everything else, the more you can do, the more they want to do. So, you know, it's still a challenge today where we can make things look better. We have better shader capability. We have, you know, better mathematics, better tools in Houdini, for instance, which is what we generally use for physical effects. However, it just always gets bigger and bigger and more. So simulation times are still very lengthy. And where that comes into play, especially on television production, where as we get into bigger and bigger TV and better production as we have in TV over the last number of years, you know, we're creating visual effects in television now that are basically on par or as good or better than many feature films that I've worked on and see today. And we're basically doing, you know, 10-hour feature film quality work. That work gets bigger, but our budgets and schedules are always a little bit truncated, and so we have to fit a lot more into a little bit of time. And I think that's what remains is the real challenge. So as we're able to do things better, we still, you know, that simulation, like that fire simulation, that could take 3 days to simulate, and that doesn't include actually rendering it, and then if there's a change to it, it's not like traditional animation where you can just go back and push and pull things around. You have to resim it and just sort of see what comes out of the mathematics. And so those remain the challenges that we deal with those kind of physical effects.
Yeah, and this you know, with Penny Dreadful is created by John Logan, who is really famous for creating these really rich worlds. And this one is taking place in 1938. It's a period piece. You also have the supernatural element of Magda, who has powers as a demon. But what was sort of the challenge in terms of like research and getting that period look correct for certain elements?
You know, John has a long history in Broadway, right? So he has this design aesthetic that is very, I think, translates very beautifully to film, and you can see that in the staging and the photography and the lighting. I mean, it's all crafted very specifically around his vision, and of course with the help of, you know, various directors and he's very choosy about the director's photography and the lighting and you know, how things are portrayed on screen, and he has a care and concern for it, just like he does for his stage work. And I think that comes through, and you can see some of that show off very well in the show with some you know, very lengthy but incredible choreography in some of these dance sequences, and there's just sort of a certain charm to some of these moments, especially around the families and around the dancing and in the, you know, in the nightclub, and that, I think that comes from his Broadway experience. And so he, you know, given that it's a period piece, but like you said, it does have this otherworldly, you know, it's kind of a horror show, right? We have these characters that are evil and sympathetic, and you know, Frank is this creepy little boy that Magda's son. It's like, well, what is he? He's, you know, and you know, his antics kind of continue as we go through this rest of the series. So he becomes kind of a little bit more of an interesting antagonist. So there's all these different things that are grounded in 1938 Los Angeles, and sort of the basis of the show is the social structure and how at that time Los Angeles was sort of in this development phase where all these different factions were against each other. You know, we had, you know, the Latino community, you had a new up and coming burgeoning city, and also the Nazi influence, which was very strong. It's funny, this is the second show I've done in the 30s. The one was Last Tycoon was the last one. And that had a strong presence of the Nazi influence into Hollywood. And so the Nazi influence, it was incredible in the United States, especially in Los Angeles and New York, in ways that we never really know about. And so all of that comes into play. In terms of research, the most important thing was authenticity. Every building that goes into this show, as far as set extensions, you know, whether it's downtown Broadway, you know, or the bigger parts of downtown Los Angeles. If we replace a building or put a building in, you know, there's a lot of work that has to go into making today's LA look like 1938. Everything from the street lamps to the signage to, you know, removing lines on streets instead of double yellow lines on streets. We put in nothing or single white lines. You know, everything down to the last detail for the most part is being addressed, and that's all just so everything looks and feels the way John knows it should. And he's very particular, but he's got a great creative vision. And the good thing is, unlike a lot of folks, he knows what he wants, and he's able to describe it very succinctly, which allows us to really go about doing the work we need to do. But he's also, you know, very collaborative. You know, if we give him things that just look right because we kind of know what he wants, he's like, yeah, that's great, love it. So he's a pleasure to work with in that way.
And I was curious because I got the chance to speak to several of the actors from the show. And a lot of them had said how impressed they were with how much of physical set there was for this period piece to act off of. And yeah. I'm curious for your job, if there is a big physical set, how does that shift your responsibilities, and what does the collaboration process become with other departments like production design?
Well, I too agree with that. It was the amount of so we shot at Melody Ranch in Los Angeles, which is this Western town. You've seen it in Deadwood, and goes back to the 50s and 60s and even the 30s and 40s of where they've been using this as an old Western town set forever. And the production design team came in and changed that entire facade of that, you know, main street, which you'd never know, into a full-blown set. When I first walked on the set, I was in awe at the amount of work that had been done on it and just how beautiful it was. But, you know, at the end of the street, there's a bunch of stuff that you can't see because you're not supposed to be in this area. So some mountains and trees and, you know, and just so the challenge there becomes that the footprint, luckily for this show, is very, very big. And so a lot of the single shots, two shots, dialogue, a lot of that was covered by backdrops and sets, and including a lot of locations downtown, you know, that's still downtown LA, just like Manhattan or, you know, or a couple of the, you know, old cities like Chicago. There's a lot of sections that still look like they did for the most part, architecturally and physically and in other ways, as they did back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever the era is. But there's always, you know, if you look left or if you look right, you can't see down that street. You can't see down that street. You can see the end of the set, and like at the end of the main street, there may have been another building or a stage, and there were stages at the one end of it. So you have to do set extensions and replacements to not only get rid of that stuff that's not you know, that's not period, and also to expand the world. One of the things that John and his creative partner Michael were very clear about is anytime it felt like that set ended at a particular spot and felt like we were in a contained world, we added, whether it was a little piece of a road or just even one building, or, you know, get rid of a tree line to add, you know, just a sense of depth to it. A lot of work done like that you'll never see in the show because it's seamless. But so that even as big as it was, the scope had to be increased in a lot of shots. I'll say there's many hundreds of set extension shots.
Yeah, and this season you also worked on The Outsider for HBO, and the interesting thing to me, the parallel between them for me is kind of they are both very grounded in reality and yet have these extreme supernatural elements to them. And so for visual effects, like there's a moment in Penny Dreadful where Magda like absorbs her son into her side, or there's a very creepy, not to spoil all of The Outsider, but there's a very creepy transformation of the villain in The Outsider. And so when you're having a show that walks the line between realism and surrealism, how do you decide on like the look of something that has to be fantastical?
Yeah, and they do. Those two shows have that similarity for sure. The difference between the two, I would say, is that The Outsider is a detective show that's that's, again, we always say it's grounded in the real world, but it is the best way to say that. You feel like it, and that's very much Stephen King, right? Stephen King asks us as an audience, for his books and his other movies and things that have been produced, to accept sort of the abnormal in our normal world, or as a part of our normal world, and we, as we do as people with theology and lore and all those kind of things. It's very much Grimm's tales kind of stuff where it's like, oh yeah, that could really happen, and that makes me feel really uncomfortable. That's very much Stephen King and The Outsider, and that also is very much part of, and I think why they chose sort of the Santa Muerte and these things that are grounded in lore in Penny Dreadful. The idea of Magda being this evil force, and her sister being Santa Muerte, who's this complex character of she's the death bringer, right? She brings people to there's all kinds of different opinions about her in Mexican culture and lore. Just as like sort of the boogeyman is in The Outsider, and how do you present that they could exist in the real world? And where that line has to be really delicately played with is where in Penny Dreadful, we had an idea, and we were sort of given the freedom to say, John Logan and companies, was like, hey, this is a horror show, right? We're not, it's not a slasher show. It's not it's not The Exorcist, but it's kind of a horror show. It's not a thriller necessarily. Things can be creepy. Things can be odd and weird. And like, for instance, the belly, the boy in the, going into her belly and being absorbed. The idea there was that, what am I seeing? Like, oh, that's weird. Oh, what is that? I mean, that's the kind of line you draw without it becoming too much about itself, and too much about the visual effect of it. Very much like The Outsider. The biggest challenge there was to depict this transformation between these different characters in a way that was, unbelievable, but believable, and then, that effect was a really tough one for us, because it's like, well, okay, we've seen a lot of morphs, we've seen a lot of things like this before. How can we do something that goes beyond that in this moment without ending the show and everybody going, oh, yeah, whatever. It's just another, visual effects, excuse to get out of the ending of the show. And hopefully we achieved it where it fit within the tone of the show. I know that Ben Mendelsohn's reaction, his character, and hitting him with the rock at the end, I thought all that played out very, very well. But again, that show's about people. It's about characters, and so is Penny Dreadful, and that's why these types of visual effects that we do in shows like this. There's thousands of visual effects in these shows, but they're all there really to support the narrative and the show without drawing too much attention to themselves. But sometimes they have to, and we just got to be careful with how we present it.
Yeah. Is there a difference for you working on something that's an adaptation, like adapting the Stephen King novel, versus Penny Dreadful that has a little bit more freedom of an original creation? Is there a difference in how you have to approach the look of visual effects?
Well, I'd say there's a difference in how the storylines are approached. Where, again, I mentioned, Stephen King has a certain tone to his stories and a certain, and I think that, everyone on the show is trying to honor that. The writers and producers and directors are given freedom to sort of shift and change that narrative a bit. The ending of the show is very different in some ways. Very similar but different in some ways from the ending of the book in The Outsider. And so as with an adaptation, you go through these creative challenges where you're trying to do something that honors the story in the book, but all through that production in particular, and ones like it that I've been on, as you start developing scripts, you realize some things that need to be changed or need to be addressed differently on screen than it is in a book, for instance. And that goes to adapting, Broadway shows too. They read and come off very differently. So the challenge in visual effects really is how to respond to those changes. how to respond to, hey, instead of, I mean, good Lord, in The Outsider, we went through round and round and round about how do we end this thing, in a really interesting way. And that creative got changed multiple times. And so we had to do a lot of bidding and prep work and a lot of design work and previs and concept work to try to push some of these ideas along and discover, visually how we think this would play out before we commit, weeks and weeks and millions of dollars to going and shoot the thing. So that's the big challenge, is sort of keeping up with the creative, helping to guide that creative, because a lot of directors and producers and other creatives that are involved with the show, are very, very, very adept at seeing things that are relatable to them. But at times I find that I'm being asked to, hey, we're going to do this at the end of the show, or we're going to do this in the show, we're going to have this visual effect. And sometimes they don't quite understand, in the end, the result won't be quite what they're thinking it is. So part of my job is to help guide and steer that creative, to take into account my experience in just sort of what that overall look will mean to the show. And then sometimes it's not right. Sometimes you have to readdress those things. So, whereas in Penny, like I said, John Logan, he knows what he wants. He knows the look of it. He, attention to detail, and he can change, the story into whatever he wants it to be. But, that experience was pretty solid from the beginning, other than, trying to pile a bunch of really big grandiose shots into the show. For instance, there was this one shot at the beginning of the show. It was just giant flyover from Pasadena all the way down to Santa Monica and over the ocean, over this Nazi ship that never made it into the show, because after we did about 3 months of previs for it, mapped everything out, did all the buildings, huge amount of work went into it. And it just didn't fit with the show. And they put it in the cut, into a preliminary cut. It just turned out that, it wasn't quite right. And so that happens.
Well, before I have to let you go, I'm always wondering with work like this, because you talked about how some of your work on this, like in Penny Dreadful, just building out the set, building out the period set, is kind of seamless, often kind of invisible work in a way. That you wouldn't normally. It's not like a big magical like Marvel movie CGI set piece.
Yeah, it's not like spaceships and aliens. Yeah.
Is it ever frustrating at all to like watch a show? Like, are you ever watching with someone and you're like, oh, they have no idea how much visual effects are actually going on there and how much it's enriching the world of the show?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I enjoy working on these types of shows where, I don't know, there's these, people have different theories about this. Yes, it's frustrating in a way because so much work goes into what appears on the surface as either simpler type of work or unnoticeable work, but it's incredibly difficult. And in many ways, I think it's more difficult to produce work that goes unnoticed. And so I take pride in that. And when you watch Penny, I'd be horrified if someone pointed something out that was just completely wrong or stood out. And it's hard to get to that 100%. If we're doing a creature, and I've done creature shows, I've done, in space stuff. I mean, I've done all that stuff, and it's fun and exciting, and the spectacle of it all is grandiose, and pushes the limits of what we can do in visual effects. So it's very fun and exciting and challenging to do those as well. But you can do a space sequence or a creature. You can get to about 85, 90, 95% in those shots, and they still look pretty fantastic and pretty real. And it's like, yeah, okay, I buy it. It's good. That can go in the show. But in the world where everything has to remain assumed and not seen, even though there's thousands of shots that might go into a show, it's really tough work to get to that 100%. And I pride myself, and we pride ourselves as visual effects artists to be able to do that type of work. So yeah, is it a rub that I can't say that I did that big giant thing in that one show? Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's fun, but I really enjoy what I do. And I do tend to specialize in those types of shows that like we're talking about, you know, The Outsider, you know, Penny Dreadful, True Detective, you know, some of that stuff. So,
yeah. Well, it's great, fascinating work, and we can't wait to see where the rest of the season of Penny Dreadful takes us.
yeah, it's great. It's really good. You're gonna love it.
Great. Well, everyone who's watching, make sure you subscribe to Gold Derby and keep in touch with us. Get all of our coverage through Emmy season. John, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.